Gary interviewed me about my books and how I came to write them and what they're about, and I read loads of goblins and stuff like that. So today I didn't really want to do this anything again, so I thought I'd talk about basically all the things that sort of influenced me, or all the science fiction and fantasy things that influenced me while I was growing up. Which this is me, I suppose, when I was about 10. Probably that must be the kind of the middle 70s. I'm on holiday somewhere with my nose in the book, and really I'm going to be talking about all the things that turned me from there into a science fiction writer. And if you're the same kind of age as I am, there'll probably be all the same things that you remember too, so it may be all quite familiar stuff. Listening to Andrew Cartmel yesterday, he was very much, all the books that he mentioned were all books that I remembered reading at that time. So I guess I don't think I have any sort of wild and extraordinary new things that you won't have heard of. But anyway, here they are, for what it's worth. The first fantasy book I ever remember being really grabbed by was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. When I was about 7, our form teacher, our class teacher, Mrs. Ellis at my school, sat us down in the corner every day and read us a bit of a story, a sort of serial at the end of the school day. And one day she started Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And I was kind of fascinated by it right from the start, by this idea. I think that was the first time I'd really come across the notion that you could invent a world. You didn't have to write about the world outside the window, or about history or something. You could just make stuff up completely and invent a whole country and a whole world of your own. So that was a big influence on me, and I went off and read that myself, and then gradually I sort of accumulated all the books and read all the Narnia series, and they were my favourite things ever for a while. Nowadays, people always tend to draw attention to the sort of Christian element of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. But as a child, maybe I was dim, but I just didn't notice that. I think unless you are religious, or unless it's pointed out to you, I don't think children do. I think you just read the story and it's all fine. Later, when I was about sort of 12 or 13, I remember looking back and thinking, no, hang on a minute. And I felt a little bit robbed, I felt like a trick had been played on me. But when I was 7, it was fine. I just loved these books. And I was completely engrossed in Narnia. But then, fairly quickly after that, I moved on to The Lord of the Rings. I don't remember at what stage I'd been read The Hobbit. My mum or dad must have read that to me when I was younger, but I don't think it made a very big impression on me. But then when I was 8 or 9 or something, they read me The Lord of the Rings, and that did make a big impression on me, and that sort of took over from Narnia, because there was no wardrobe element involved. In Narnia, it starts off in our world, and you have to go through a magical wardrobe, and you end up in this invented world. Which is all fine. But Lord of the Rings, there's no wardrobe. You're straight into the invented world, and that was very important to me. It was even more sort of immersive somehow. And I think this is the thing that sort of separates fantasy readers. Some people really like the idea that you move from our world into an imagined world, but I kind of like to be dumped straight into the imagined world and have to work it all out for myself as the story unfolds. So Lord of the Rings sort of blew away my Narnia fixation, and I had quite a serious Tolkien fixation for a long time. I couldn't find an image of the Tolkien map that I had on my bedroom wall, but we all know that the Tolkien map. It was in the back of the hardbacks that I used to borrow from the Brighton Library, and it folded out on kind of very thin tissue paper, and it was this, but with some of the lettering in red, so it was a beautiful thing. And you pore over these maps for ages. And it does a very important thing, or something that I think is very important if you're creating a fantasy world, that there's loads of stuff on here that isn't in the story. It may have cropped up in the Silmarillion or something, or those other bits that Tolkien never particularly wanted to publish and I never bothered reading. But in The Lord of the Rings, the story sort of wanders down here, doesn't it? And you've got all this other stuff all over the place that's mentioned, and he knows the names of it, and he knows where it is and how it relates to other things. But it never actually features in the book. And I think that's important if you're coming up with a world of your own, that there has to be more of it than you're talking about in the story. You have to be able to allude to all sorts of other stuff. And Tolkien is tremendously good at that. And when his characters are wandering along, they sort of pass turnings and the turn-offs from the road, and they say, oh yes, that road goes to so-and-so and so-and-so, and eventually all the way down to such and such a place. None of which ever features in the story or has any importance at all, but it just makes the world feel more real. So that was a big influence on me when I was a child, and that sort of remained so, really, because when I set out to create a fantasy or a science fiction world, that's kind of the the model that I'm always keeping in the back of my mind. There were other things. I loved reading a lot. I didn't read a lot of fantasy as a child. The funny thing about it is, I think when you're a child, you don't really have that much choice in what you read. You're very much constrained by kind of what's on the shelves in the school library or the public library, or what your parents may have to put in front of you. So there were lots of things that I missed, and I remember reading lots of kind of myths and legends, and lots of historical novels, Rosemary Sutcliffe and people like that. Don't remember reading an awful lot of other fantasy books. So, some of the ones I did read were, anybody remember those? Lloyd Alexander. He's an American writer, I think from about the 60s sometime. And they're basically Tolkien knockoffs, I think. The Book of Three particularly, it's very, it's sort of people on a quest in a fantasy world. Lots of names borrowed from Welsh mythology, from the Mabinogion, and places like that. But I do remember enjoying them. They're like the Lord of the Rings, but they're a lot shorter, and they're not so well written, and they're quite funny. There's quite a lot of jokes in them, and those are all important things because the fact that they're not tremendously well written, and that made it feel kind of achievable. Whereas Tolkien was this kind of great sort of god turning out this stuff. I kind of read these and thought, oh, this is good. I could kind of do this, and that's helped me to sort of encouraged me to start. Writing my own stuff, I think. And also the humour is very important. There were lots of good gags in these books. So when I did my Goblins series, this is one of the kind of models I had in mind for that, really. A lot of the time when I'm writing, I'm trying to recreate a sort of feeling that I had about something when I was a child, or I'm trying to kind of, do my own version of something that I liked. And the things that I find I liked most are the things that I liked between the ages of kind of 10 and 18 or something. I think you have a very passionate connection to things in those days that maybe it's harder to find as you get older. So these were a big influence on me, and they were a big influence another way because the illustrations are early works by an illustrator called Brian Froud on the covers. They're not illustrated inside. So that was the first time I come across his work, and I remember looking at them on the back. And the first two, it doesn't credit the illustrator, as books don't in those days. But by the third one, I think he was a bit more established, and maybe had a bit more clout. And it said, cover illustration by Brian Froud. And I thought, ooh, I like his stuff. So that was probably the first time possibly the first time I connected, actually found an illustrator's name and started to work out that, yes, there's somebody who does these pictures on the fronts of books. Possibly a bit better known, Alan Garner. I guess probably everybody of my age will have read him. Do either of you know Alan Garner at all? There's a book called The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, which is quite famous that he wrote, which I'm not that keen on, to be honest. I liked it when I was a child, but when I went back to read it later, I couldn't really get through it. But The Owl Service is an amazing thing. It's a most peculiar book. It's about two teenagers, basically, or a family, and I think the main protagonists are two teenagers, and they're staying in a house in Wales for the holidays. And it's sort of haunted, but not exactly. There aren't ghosts or anything, but they're somehow connected mysteriously to these ancient happenings in Welsh mythology. And the Mabinogion, again, this great collection of Welsh myths, which seems to have inspired all the writers I read as a child. And of course I went off in search of it. I went and got my copy of the Mabinogion at the age of 9 or 10 and sat there trying to read it. And it's kind of hard going, even for an adult, but I remember ploughing through it and sort of occasionally gleaning little bits of story or information from it. And yes, The Owl Service, so it's a really peculiar book, and it's well worth reading. It's very oddly written. There's almost no description in it. It's page after page of just dialogue. It's almost like reading a radio play. It's very interesting in the way it's structured and its form. And as a child, I didn't really understand it. It's got a very peculiar. It doesn't really explain anything very well, very sort of clearly. It doesn't tie up its loose ends. It's not that sort of book. It's about atmosphere and strangeness. So I read it and didn't really understand it. And unlike, mostly when I was a child, if I didn't understand something, I'd stop reading, or I'd just abandon it, or I'd go, that wasn't very good. But The Owl Service, for some reason, fascinated me, so I didn't understand it, so I went straight back to the beginning and read it again, and again, and again, and I read it many times. And I read it again a couple of years ago. I still didn't really understand it, but it's still brilliant. So that was another major influence. And all this stuff is fantasy. You'll notice, as a child, growing up, sort of up to the age of about 10 or 11, I didn't like science fiction. That was not my cup of tea at all. I liked fantasy, and I liked myths and legends and history and stuff. But science fiction was frightening. basically. I didn't like the idea of that at all. It tended to be about scary stuff happening, monsters and aliens and robots and things. And it was all set in the future, and I wasn't really interested in the future very much. I kind of much preferred the past, or some sort of idealised Tolkienian vision of the past. So I was a fantasy buff, and I avoided science fiction very, very carefully until that happened. And I remember going. It must have been the summer holidays of 1977, probably. No, 1976. 1976, probably. I went to the cinema to see Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger. It was the first time I've been to the cinema on my own. And I remember sitting there waiting for the film to start and worrying, was I actually in the right screen of the Odeon? Because I'd never done it myself before. You know, I've never actually been responsible for buying my own ticket and finding my own seat and things. And the trailer for Star Wars came on, and I'd never heard of it. You know, it was the first. It came completely out of the blue, and it was quite a sort of lengthy trailer with lots of very quick clips from the film in it. And I remember the tagline, which was a boy, a girl, and a galaxy of adventure. Yeah. And I thought, oh wow, yes, I want to see that. And then for you know, that must have been sort of the August, and Star Wars didn't actually get released over here until sort of the Christmas, I suppose. So that autumn was this great sort of bow wave of publicity for it arriving. So by the time the film, you know, by the time I actually got along to see the movie, I kind of knew everything about it because I read all the books and all the magazines and the comics and everything. So it was but that didn't matter at all. Somehow it was fine. I didn't care that I knew everything that was going to happen. I think what it was, I'd always had this vision of science fiction as being this rather kind of cold and clinical, and it tended to happen in white, gleaming white rooms to people in very sort of clean lycra jumpsuits and things. And Star Wars looked old. All this stuff looked sort of scuffed, and it had a history. You know, the buildings looked old, and the clothes were a bit battered and threadbare, and all the stuff is kind of rusty, and there's a lot of history in there. You know, there's a lot of sort of little tweaked kind of historical references that even I could get as an 11-year-old. And I loved all that, you know, instantly. That made great sense to me, and suddenly I liked science fiction. I liked the scenes on the desert planets at the beginning best. You know, those to me were what the film was about. And that shot there, where the Millennium Falcon takes off and they leave Tatooine. At that point, my sort of enjoyment sort of slightly, you know, I kind of knew I had to sit through all the kind of James Bond running around in corridors stuff, which didn't really interest me nearly so much. It was the desert planet with its sort of, again, it's that illusions thing. You know, you sort of sense that there's a whole world, a whole galaxy going on here, and all you're seeing of it is this one corner. But it felt very real to me at the time. So that was fine. You know, I didn't mind the rest of it, the running around and space battles and things, but I sort of sat through them thinking, yes, I must come back and see this again so I can enjoy the first 20 minutes once more. So then, after that, I was a science fiction fan. And what does a science fiction fan do in those days? Well, you didn't go out and get videos or anything because they hadn't been invented. So all I could do was watch any sci-fi movie that happened to come on telly and go to the library and find science fiction books to read. So those are... I mean, it's impossible to remember now most of what I read. I guess I was largely reading short stories in anthologies, and so I plugged all sort of Asimov and Heinlein and all these things. My dad, at some point, came home from work with a big box that he bought from somebody of old Galaxy and If and Astounding magazines. I don't think it was anything sort of wildly collectible or anything, but they were somebody's collection from the 60s. And so there was a great stack of these magazines. And I remember if I was at home with a cold or flu or something off school, I would sort of lie in bed and read through these things endlessly. So that way, I got this sort of great grounding in all the kind of, not exactly golden age stuff, but you know, the slightly later, the 50s and 60s writers. Many of whom I've forgotten, and many of them weren't very good. Of course, you get an issue of one of these magazines, there might be a Heinlein or an Asimov story in it. Most of them will be by people we've probably never even heard of now because they're forgotten. But they were still a big influence on me. And again, actually, bad writers are hugely encouraging thing for a would-be writer. It's depressing. If you just read the greats all the time, you think, oh, I can't do this. But if you read something that's just kind of a bit there, you know, it's okay. You think, oh, yeah, I could have a go at that, you know. So hooray for bad writers. I like to think that my stuff will have this effect on the children of the future. So what else? Oh yes, the Chrysalids. John Wyndham was, that was sort of the only sci-fi that was on my parents' bookshelves was John Wyndham, because he somehow had managed to be not really published as a science fiction author. He was in Penguin. He was kind of quite a serious grown-up author. Science fiction had kind of lurid pictures on the covers, but John Wyndham didn't have any pictures on the covers at all because it was so serious. And the Chrysalids is a fantastic book. Day of the Triffids is the first one that I read and the one that is most famous. But I think some of the others are possibly better books. And the Chrysalids I like very much. It's a kind of post-apocalyptic thing, and I think it was when you're at that. It's I know now that it's quite cliche, the kind of sort of post-apocalyptic nuclear. It's kind of a post-atomic world which has kind of reverted to a kind of sort of New England during the witch hunts kind of vibe, except that the witches they're hunting are mutants who have telepathic powers or are mutated in any way. They have to be kind of weeded out and destroyed. Which, of course, now I realise is quite a common trope in science fiction. But, of course, I was 12 or 13 the first time I come across it, and it was extraordinary to me. The Kraken Wakes is another John Wyndham great alien invasion story, which comes from comes up from a strange angle. And he was very much very badly served by Brian Aldiss, I think, who said John Wyndham wrote cosy catastrophes. You get this cliche that's thrown around about him and some of his contemporaries, that they wrote cosy catastrophes. There is nothing cosy about John Wyndham. Day of the Triffids, Kraken Wakes, these are descriptions of society falling apart by somebody who had lived through the war and knew what happens when society falls apart. And they're good books. They may be dated in some ways, but I don't even know if I'd follow that through. Actually, I think they're just good books and should be read. Other stuff. War of the Worlds. That was another favourite. I very much like. I think I was still a little bit frightened of science fiction in the future. So the fact that these things took place safely in the Victorian era was quite an encouragement. So I went all through the H.G. Wells books, of which The War of the Worlds probably was my favourite at the time. And of course that came back because later on, when I was sort of in my 20s, I was thinking, I was actually making movies at the time. I was making low-budget movies, and I wanted to do a science fiction movie. And I thought, well, I can't really afford to do sort of spaceships and things, and also that's a bit boring because there's a lot of it around. So, I know, I'll do a Victorian science fiction movie. So that was in about, I suppose that was about 1989 or something. So that was when I invented steampunk. But little realising that loads of other people had also invented steampunk at around the same time, of course. I don't claim sole responsibility for that one. But yeah, so H.G. Wells kind of echoed on. Andre Norton, Andrew Cartmel mentioned her yesterday. She was the science fiction section in my school library. For some reason, whether this reflected, the actual sort of her actual status, or whether it was just the enthusiasm of my librarian, I don't know. But lots and lots of Andre Norton, Plague Ship and Starborn, all sorts of stuff. So I read loads of these. And as Andrew said, she is a woman who had had to adopt a male name to sort of get by in the sexist environment of 1950s and 60s science fiction. But I was too ignorant to know that Andre was a man's name. I thought it was a woman's name. So I just assumed she was a woman. So somehow 60s sexism in science fiction short-circuited itself completely, and I ignored that. I just assumed she was a woman. Dune, I only put that in because I do remember reading that on a long holiday when I was about 12 or 13. That's a lot of book. That just shows you how excited I was by Star Wars and by science fiction, that I was prepared to plough through this never-ending book that I sort of kind of understood, but there must have been a lot in it that went straight over my head, I think. And Prosto Plus. Has anybody read that? No. The Dentist, yes. I think it's the only Piers Anthony I've ever read. I don't remember, I don't know if it's actually any good or not. It's about a dentist who is abducted by aliens and taken off on their flying saucer to do dentistry for other aliens. And he, there are sort of like, there are 3 or 4 sections, and he goes around performing dental surgery on various different races. There's a sort of huge whale-like species, and he has to climb right into their mouth with a drill and that kind of thing. And I really put that in because that was in, I think that was sort of about 1979 I read that, and I remember thinking, oh, okay, I could kind of nick this idea and do it in a fantasy world and have, a vet going into a fantasy world and having to deal with dragons and unicorns and trolls and stuff. I think that even at that tender age, I was basically doing what writers do, which is nicking other people's ideas and putting our own spin on them. So that's why that's up there. And then gradually, as I was reading all this stuff, certain names started to recur. You know, first of all, I thought, oh, great, science fiction anthology, I shall read these science fiction stories. And then there came the point of thinking, oh, yes, okay, that's by him, and that's by her, and oh, I like these ones. And, you know, favourite authors start to develop. Whom the first was Ray Bradbury, who I'm sure most of you will know, and if you don't, you should seek it out, because he's brilliant.
But not his horror stuff.
Sorry?
His horror stuff is really creepy.
It is really creepy,
The
yes.
only book I've ever put down halfway through because I went, yeah, I just can't read this anymore.
Which?
I can't remember. It was one of his horror short story collections, and I went, yeah, this is right. He's
something wicked this returns.
no, I can't remember which one it was. But I went, yeah, he's a really good author, but he's too good.
Yes, he is creepy. But, and I never really liked horror, but I didn't mind reading Ray Bradbury's horror. I didn't like being scared, basically, as a child. I was very wary of anything that I thought was going to be frightening. But Ray Bradbury got by. You know, I didn't mind him frightening me because he did it so beautifully. He was the first writer I ever read for the language, you know, as much as for the stories. The first writer I realised there was something going on in his kind of choice of words and his use of language. And I've just taken the first paragraph of a story called Mars's Heaven, which is one of the stories in the Martian Chronicles. This is how it opens, and this is, I remember reading this and thinking, yes, this is my kind of science fiction. The ship came down from space. It came from the stars and the black velocities and the shining movements and the silent gulfs of space. It was a new ship. It had fire in its body and men in its metal cells, and it moved with a clean silence, fiery and warm. In it were 17 men, including a captain. The crowd at the Ohio field had shouted and waved their hands up into the sunlight, and the rocket had bloomed out great flowers of heat and colour and run away into space on the third voyage to Mars. And that, I just remember being excited by the language he used. And now, often when I look back at Bradbury, I find he's used a bit too much of it. It's a little bit purple, a little bit too sugary. But when I was 12, 13, 14, that didn't bother me at all. I just loved it, and I loved the things he did with words and the games he played with language. And that was one of the first things that ever started me trying to do things like that, and starting to think about the language I was using as much as the story I was trying to tell. And then slightly later, the other writer whose stuff I kept finding in these magazines and being kind of fascinated by, even though occasionally it went wildly over my head, was J.G. Ballard, who kind of became an enduring influence, really, because in my 20s I went off science fiction completely. I kind of turned my back on it and walked away from it. But I kept on reading Ballard and returning to his science fiction stories, which are I think, some of the oddest science fiction stories ever written. You won't find ray guns and robots and time machines in them very much. They're kind of more about, you know, the angle between two walls, or sunlight creeping across derelict launch pans and things like that. And again, this very peculiar and distinctive use of language. And again, I've just taken a first paragraph from a story called The Voices of Time, which is one that I remember grabbing me in a sort of yellowing anthology of stories from New Worlds magazine or something. This one that starts, later, Powers often thought of Whitby, and the strange grooves the biologist had cut, apparently at random, all over the floor of the empty swimming pool. An inch deep and 20 feet long, interlocking to form an elaborate ideogram like a Chinese character. They had taken him all summer to complete, and he had obviously thought about little else, working away tirelessly through the long desert afternoons. Which is kind of a classic Ballard opening paragraph, because in a way, he's more like a painter than a writer. He keeps returning to this quite small set of images. The empty swimming pool is a classic sort of, if you wanted a Ballard tick box, you'd have empty swimming pools, deserted airfields, motorway flyovers, this very sort of precise Ballardian landscape, which he returns to obsessively, and as if he's always trying to get something right. And the stories themselves are kind of, often they don't really work. They don't really have third acts. They're these sort of strange kind of severed feeling things, usually about people succumbing to strange obsessions and paranoia. But they have this eerie atmosphere of their own. And he both showed me sort of what science fiction could do, and also in a way, way out of science fiction, because he also, he moved on from it. He started writing other things, which I then read, and so that sort of led me into other forms of literature. So he was quite an important influence. And then, of course, the other thing, if you were a young you know, you're growing up and you'd seen Star Wars and you liked science fiction and you couldn't get buy videos because they hadn't been invented yet, and you been to the library and you'd read all their science fiction books. The other thing you did was watch Doctor Who, which I hadn't actually done until I was about 11 or 12. I was very late coming to Doctor Who because of the scary thing. I didn't want to be scared. And everybody at school watched Doctor Who and said, oh, it's so scary, that bit where, you know, etc. The monster appears. And I thought, I'm not watching that. And occasionally, out of peer pressure, I would try. I'd think, okay, I really ought to watch Doctor Who because everybody else does. And I'd sit down and it would go, and John Pertwee's big face would appear like a scary owl out of the television. And I think, no, it's not for me. I never watched it. But then after Star Wars, I was hungry for anything science fiction-y, so I started watching Doctor Who. I think it was round about the time that Leela came in as his companion, and I watched it, I think, pretty much until Tom Baker left, and after that I kind of lost touch with it again. But I did enjoy it for a long time. I think I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it, actually. I'm sceptical about the the revived Doctor Who. I've never been particularly impressed by any of those. And I kind of come to think, oh yeah, you know, it was always rubbish, and I was just remembering it through the kind of rose-tinted spectacles of nostalgia, and that it had never been any good. But then last year, or the year before last, I was commissioned to write a Doctor Who story. There was an anthology put together for the anniversary. What was it, the 50th anniversary? Yes, yes. Puffin put out an anthology, and they asked different children's writers to write about each Doctor. And they asked me if I'd write about Tom Baker, which was good, because he's the only one I could have written about, because he's the only one I ever watched. So I went back and watched a couple of them, and I found I kind of knew them. I'd only seen them once. I saw them when they were broadcast. I'd never had a chance to, you know, I'd never bothered seeking them out on DVD or anything before. But I just knew them. I knew virtually every line of these things. The one set in Paris, which I think is regarded as a bit of a classic, city of death or doom and destruction or something. And there was one set on Pluto, which I remembered for some reason, called the Sunmakers. Yeah. Which was kind of an odd one. It didn't really have a monster in it or anything like that. It was sort of political satire, really. It's a little bit like Brazil in some ways. But it, again, for some reason, I completely remembered it. And I don't know, it obviously was a huge influence on me at that time, which I think I'd sort of absorbed so completely that I'd forgotten it was an influence. But certainly when I was writing this story of mine, I could hear their voices completely in my head. It was so easy writing the dialogue. It was great. It was like I had a little Tom Baker and what's her name? Louise Jameson, thank you. Yes, chattering in my ear. It was fantastic. So yeah, that was an influence, and of course that was at the time. And I think the reason why it appealed to me so much was that was when Douglas Adams was the script editor, and it has a lot of his that sort of quirky. The sort of game-playing quality of Douglas Adams, that kind of taking little strange ideas for a walk, and a sort of bravura quality to it. Even the City of Death, the Paris one, they end up going back in time to the beginnings of life on Earth. Kind of, you know, it seems perfectly natural that there's some sort of complicated plot where there's a character living in Paris in the present day who is selling endless copies of the Mona Lisa, which he's got by going back in time and getting Leonardo to paint extra copies of it. And in this way, he's funding building a spaceship so that he can escape from the planet, but somehow it all ends up back at the dawn of life. And all these sort of strange, disparate elements just kind of flow quite naturally in this wacky story. So, yes, Douglas Adams was another sort of big love in the early 80s, I guess. I think I heard the first broadcast of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'd seen in the Radio Times, new science fiction series starting. I thought, oh, I like science fiction. It was way past my bedtime. It was in the graveyard slot, sort of 10:30 on a Tuesday night on Radio 4. And I think I was supposed to be in bed by 9 or 9:30 at the very least. I carefully got my radio out and put it under the covers and turned it so you could just hear it. It was like a little whisper coming out, and laid the ear against it, and I was able to hear the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But sometimes my cover was blown because I'd fall asleep on the radio and wake up with the sort of waffle pattern speaker embossed in my ear, and have to have breakfast like this. And then sort of a year or so later, the record was released. It was only available at Virgin record shops, which were kind of, you know, not megastores in those days, but strange little dark cubby holes full of punks and quite frightening. So I kind of edged into there, and I think that was the first album I ever bought, because I wasn't a great music fan or anything. So, and I sort of listened to that until it was worn through pretty much. What else was going on in science fiction in the early 80s? And scuffing up my brain. Oh, Blake Seven. Yes. Blake Seven seemed so gritty. and sort of edgy and realistic to me. You know, compared with Doctor Who, which had this kind of fantasy element. The first episode of Blake Seven is set in this kind of dystopian police state, and he ends up being sort of tried for treason or something and shipped off on a horrible, grubby little spaceship full of convicts to some prison planet. And it felt kind of quite dark. And I think, you know, again, as with you know, the Chrysalids being my first experience of that kind of post-nuclear thing, I guess this was probably one of my first experiences of the whole kind of 1984 surveillance state kind of idea. So it did feel quite sort of, you know, like something that was probably slightly too grown up for me to be watching. So I've never gone back to Blake 7. Is it any good? Have you seen it?
The third,
It's very good.
I think the first half of the first series was very good when they had that gritty darkness, and then it got fluffy.
Right.
Ridiculous.
Okay. I do remember one, and again, it's that thing that, you know, the bad writers encourage you to write. And I kind of like making movies at that time as well. I had my dad's little Super 8 cinefilm camera, and I was always trying to make films. And there was one episode of Blake 7 where they had to destroy or take over or something, the kind of the Federation's main kind of communications hub for the whole galaxy. So the whole plot builds up to this, and they get to the communications hub, and it's a cement works. And on the chain link fence outside is a notice that says communications hub for the whole galaxy, and it was on a piece of paper tied to the chain links, and it was done in exactly the same stencil that I had in my pencil case for school. So I thought, yes, I too can make science fiction films. And it was actually kind of wonderful, that. Yes, it was. But there's also something kind of really odd about seeing, you know, your local cement works as the communications hub of the galaxy. It's a bit like, you know, Alphaville, when Lemmy Caution goes to the planet Alphaville. He doesn't go on a spaceship, he just drives his Ford Popular down a Parisian motorway, which is supposed to be a sort of intersidereal high route or something like that. And it's that sort of strange, you know, taking the things of ordinary life and saying, yes, you know, this is the distant future on another planet. I kind of actually think there's something quite good about that. I think it sort of there's something rather odd and striking about it, and that's something I kind of return to as well. I don't think Blake 7 has actually influenced me in any other way, except, of course, that when Sarah McIntyre and I are trying to publicise our stuff, I think there's a certain kind of Blake 7 element that has crept into the costumes in those, because there's no point writing children's books unless you can get to dress up like a glam rock spaceman. The other thing, Quatermass. I was too young to have seen the sort of first great Quatermass serials, because they mostly aired in the, I suppose, even the 50s, late 50s, the first one, wasn't it, in the 60s. So I was way too young for those. But in 1979, the Quatermass conclusion, as it's sometimes called, the fourth Quatermass, aired with John Mills, which was a fantastic thing. I love it. I really do. I think it's great. I still think it's one of the best bits of science fiction I've ever seen on television. It was wonderful. It was really curmudgeonly, which a lot of people hate. It's basically set in a future where everything's collapsing, you know, the whole. And when you were living in the 1970s in Britain, this kind of felt. This was where we were going. It was completely believable that, you know, in another few years there were going to be kind of gangs fighting across the ruins of London. And the thing that really struck me, I remember, is they're driving along a sort of motorway with cars abandoned on each side of it, and there's the radio announcer comes on and says, you know, says something about the news, and then says, and here are tomorrow's power cuts. And it was sort of, yes, you know, we knew this was what the future was going to be like. And into this sort of blighted future comes this strange kind of. You gradually realise that all the blight is not just natural, but there's this sort of alien influence that's been going on for thousands of years, which is a very typical Nigel Neal idea. And basically there are people called planet people who are sort of hippies. It's a curmudgeon's take on 70s culture, basically, and the hippies are all sort of happily dancing around, and they go and congregate at stone circles where they believe they're going to be beamed up to another planet where everything will be lovely. And Quatermass is there at one point when they do congregate at a stone circle, and this huge beam of light comes down out of the sky, and they all vanish, as if it will come true. But in fact it hasn't. They're being harvested. It's some sort of vast alien machine. It's just kind of luring people to these places and then harvesting them. And of course it's all happened before, which is why there are stone circles that mark these sites. It's a wonderful story, and everything comes together. All these disparate elements all gradually become part of this main story. And you never see the aliens. You never see. There's no great spaceship hovering overhead. You never know whether they're even intelligent, whether it's just some sort of machine that's working, or whether there's a consciousness behind it. It's a magnificent, bleak, strange story. And it haunted me completely when I first saw it. And I went back and watched this again a couple of years back. It's on DVD now, and it's still very haunting. It's very strangely structured. I think they made it so that it could be released both as a 4-part television series and as a film. And that means that neither works, because the film is it's too fast, and the television series has got endless amounts of padding in it. But it is great. There's greatness in there. And of course, I then went back from that and read all the scripts and things for the other Quatermae, which were the only, the nearest I could get to actually seeing them. Oh, and there are the Hammer film versions, of course. They crop up on television from time to time. Nigel Kneale is a fantastic writer. He's so good at the sort of the minor characters and the little bits of dialogue and stuff. He knows exactly how people talk and how people react to things, and so it all feels completely real. He's a terrific author. Now, are you all right? Is this okay? I'm not boring you, am I? Is it all right? It feels a bit self-indulgent, but
taking us a trip through our
You're
childhood.
indulging me as well. This is my childhood.
Yeah,
That's
we were all there.
right, you remember when I showed you Lloyd Alexander? If you read the Lloyd Alexander books, I tell them over and went, oh, Brian Froud did the cover illustration. I like his stuff. In 79, one of the bookshops in Brighton, I was sort of wandering around, and they had a book called The Land of Froud, and it was a collection of illustrations by Brian Froud. It was a sort of big art book, and it cost $3.95. I think I got 50p pocket money, so that was kind of quite a major. I couldn't afford it. I had to leave it on the shelf, and it was wrapped up in cellophane as well. It was one of these sort of art books that's so posh that it has to be wrapped. And I didn't have, I was a little spod. I didn't have the nerve to say, could I wrap this and have a look at it? So I just kind of hid it and hoped nobody else would buy it. And went back when I got $3.95 and bought it, and it was fantastic. It was, it's probably the most influential book I've ever opened because, it turned me into an illustrator basically. I opened it not knowing what I wanted to do, and I closed it thinking, yes, I'm going to be an illustrator. Also, he lived on Dartmoor and is very inspired by the landscape of Dartmoor, and I'd already fallen in love with Dartmoor kind of independently on family holidays. But that also kind of, yes, I'm going to be an illustrator and live on Dartmoor like Brian Froud. And that became my kind of, that was my ambition throughout my teens. And eventually it came true. Yes, lots of sort of fairy paintings and fantasy folklore things. I think most of them, some of them are collected from other books that he'd illustrated, but most of them I think he just painted for this book. I think some publisher had said, oh, could we do a collection of your work, Brian? And there wasn't really enough or not enough that he liked, so he just sat down and did sort of 30 or 40 of these big kind of fantasy paintings, all steeped in the landscape of Dartmoor and with these odd trolls and goblins and things. Big influence on goblins, of course. When I was writing that, I was basically thinking of Brian Froud all the time. And he lived up near Chagford with another illustrator, Alan Lee, who I know has been a guest at Armadacon in the past.
Brian's been a past guest.
Oh, has he? Oh, brilliant. And they both became, I liked and I still like the kind of the quirkiness, the sort of slight cartoony element of Froud, the slightly more stylised way he treats trees and stuff. So he was always my main man. But Alan Lee is sort of recreating the kind of whole 19th century watercolour tradition, and he's a wonderful artist, and of course probably best known now for the Lord of the Rings movies. So that's what I did kind of right through the early part of the 80s, really, is I sat in my room and I tried to draw like Brian Froud and Alan Lee. And when I wasn't doing that, I occasionally went to the cinema. Oh, and yes, Alien. That's another big influence. And again, it was kind of the production design that got me. I was always looking at the stuff. I could, the Alien I could take or leave. The story, not that bothered about, but the stuff I just loved. There was a big. I think I was too young to see Alien when it came out. I didn't see it for years and years, but. There was a big book called The Art of Alien, which I used to kind of pore over, and it had all Ron Cobb's designs for the spaceship interiors and the costumes. And again, it actually goes back to Tolkien. It's that sort of world-building by illusion thing, because in Alien you don't really know anything about the society they've come from. Nothing's ever said about, there are no names given or anything like that. But you kind of pick it up by the stuff, the little uniform patches and just the sort of general ambience of it. So it's that whole world building thing again, which always fascinates me. The art director on Alien and on Star Wars actually is a chap called Roger Christian, and it's difficult to, obviously loads and loads of artists and designers will move through a big movie and all leave their mark on it in different ways. So the spacesuits in Alien are completely Mobius, but I think he only spent about 2 days on the movie, but he's left his mark there. But I think it's all sort of marshalled together by this chap called Roger Christian, When I went along to see The Empire Strikes Back, when that was first released, it had a strange little supporting feature with it called the Black Angel. Does anybody remember the Black Angel at all? Because I do, because it fascinated me. And it was made by Roger Christian. I think he'd met George Lucas as art director on Star Wars, and George Lucas had given him the money to make this little low-budget fantasy movie. And I hadn't really seen fantasy on the big screen until then. You know, there was lots of science fiction at the cinema, but for fantasy stuff, I had to go to Brian Froud and Alan Lee and Tolkien. I had to, you know, it was something that I found in books and in pictures. The movies didn't do it. And then I went and saw this, and the movies did do it. You know, it's very much, you can kind of, if you know Alan Lee's work, you can kind of see instantly that so does Roger Christian. It's all shot up in the sort of Scottish Highlands, and it's full of these kind of strange misty landscapes. It's a kind of odd, dreamlike story about a knight on a quest to beat death. He's obviously, Mr. Christian's obviously seen the Seventh Seal a few too many times, and it's not really all that, you know, as a story it doesn't actually work very well. It's not that interesting, and it ends rather suddenly and abruptly. But as a series of images, it was fantastic. I think I went back and saw The Empire Strikes Back a second time, purely to see the opening feature, in fact, because I was so taken with the imagery. Somebody else who was very taken with the imagery was John Boorman, who was just about to start shooting Excalibur, and he had a screening of this for his cast and crew, saying this is what we're after. And so the next year I went back to the cinema and saw Excalibur, and it had exactly that same thing that had fascinated me about the Black Angel. It's very much made of the same elements, but with a fantastic story and better acting and stuff. And that really became my sort of big thing for a long time. That obsessed me completely. I just loved that film. I don't know if, you know, maybe if it hadn't come along, some other film would have come and done the same job. But Excalibur was the one for me, and I won't bang on about it at too much length, but if you want to hear me banging on about it at length, you can just look at my blog, where I quite often go about it. But no, I loved it, and it seemed to be, it was just full of stuff, you know, the landscapes and the colours and the atmosphere, all the stuff I loved. It felt like it had been made for me, you know. And even the bits that I didn't love, I was prepared to love because they were in Excalibur. And it led me to all sorts of strange places. You know how things can do this? I say this is what I had instead of a university education, because it led me on to all sorts of stuff. It led me to, you know, artists I'd never bothered looking at before, to the Pre-Raphaelites, for example, who were very, you know, equally obsessed with the Arthurian legend, and some element of their stuff comes through in Excalibur, and I found their books books of their work in the library and went and looked at them, and then I trekked up to London and went under Tate looking at all the originals. And so these were the first actual painters I'd become interested in, rather than just illustrators. You know, suddenly I was interested in art. And once you're, you know, the Pre-Raphaelites sort of quite good sort of entry-level art history. But once you found the Pre-Raphaelites, then of course that leads you back to the Romantics, and it leads you on to the Symbolists. And then once you're on the Symbolists, then you're into sort of Picasso and people like that. So the whole world of art history opened up to me, thanks to me buying a cinema ticket to go and see Excalibur. Then Blade Runner, I suppose I should mention, just because it was another, you know, it was another sort of big, it was the other big sci-fi film of the 80s, and extraordinarily influential. You know, suddenly everything looked like that, and everything kind of still does, really, pretty much nowadays. You go and see a science fiction film, and people will occasionally make, you know, bold attempts to do something different, but, you know, it all seems to revert back to Blade Runner in the end. And I remember again sitting in the cinema, and that first opening sort of aerial shot across Los Angeles with the flares coming up from the refineries and stuff was absolutely extraordinary. This amazing plunge into a future world, which is you know, obviously something I'm sort of trying to do in my books. That thing of just sort of tipping the reader or the viewer into this made-up world and making it feel real, which to me is what good fantasy and science fiction is all about. And Brian Froud, of course, was busy in the movies by then as well, because he went off and designed Dark Crystal. I was terribly excited when that happened, you know, because Brian Froud had been like a secret. You know, I didn't know anybody else had even heard of him. And then I opened a colour supplement one day, and it said, oh yes, Jim Henson from the Muppets is making a movie, and he's using these illustrations by an illustrator called Brian Froud. And I thought, oh wow, great. I rushed off to see the Dark Crystal, which is an extraordinary thing. It's, I mean, again, story not up to much really, but as a visual thing, as you know, one artist's vision translated into film, it's really quite amazing. You know, he designed everything. He must have worked phenomenally hard on that. Everything from you know, the sort of tiniest little flowers and things in the corners of the frame up to the main characters themselves, all designed by Froud, and all lovely, and you know, the puppetry stands up fantastically well, I think, these days. It's an amazing looking movie.
I think it was re-released not so long. It was re-digitised and re-released not so long ago.
Oh, was it? Right. Yes, I've got an old DVD copy of it. Again, as I say, you know, the story is a little bit sort of Tolkien by numbers, but visually, it's a great thing. And then, of course, from Labyrinth is an odd movie, isn't it? When it came out, I think it was very, very underrated, and now it seems to be very, very overrated. Because it's not much good, honestly. I mean, it's full of rubbish, but there's also lots of good stuff in there. There's lots of nuggets of greatness. Yes.
Brian Froud's son.
Brian Froud's son. Yes, absolutely.
Who has also been in Armadacon.
Oh, brilliant!
Yeah.
That's quite a good start in life, isn't it? Being hugged by the Dame. And again, you know, you can see where my goblins come from. Basically, I think my book Goblins. That's what I would do if I had the set of Labyrinth at my disposal and cast, you know, and puppets. So there we go. That's what Brian Froud was up to. What David Bowie was up to, I don't know. I think a lot of people wondered at the time. People were going, "What's he doing this for?" But it turned out quite a good career move, of course, which I'm sure he knew at the time, because every generation of children will watch it on video and know who he is, which is quite a good thing. David Bowie was actually one of the few musicians I was into. I wasn't, as I was saying earlier, I wasn't a great music fan, but I like David Bowie because I think because it was science fiction music. You know, he wasn't singing about kind of love and stuff that seemed unlikely ever to happen to me. He was singing about kind of one alien Superman and bleak futures and stuff. And so I like that. That was sci-fi. That was all right. And when I started doing my new book recently, and I told Sarah McIntyre that I was working on this thing about trains, and she said, "Oh, I suppose it's going to be called Station to Station, is it?" And I went, "No." As a private joke, I started calling it Low Heroes. And just as a sort of working title. And it's the odd way that influences can work on you, because originally I've been working on this story about quite a sort of privileged young woman, almost sort of like a princess in some great trading clan in this futuristic society. But then it was called Low Heroes, and I started thinking, well, what is a low hero? It must be somebody, you know, sort of like a thief or somebody from the sort of the dregs of society, making his own way. And so the whole story changed, and I found myself writing about this young sort of street kid. So thanks, Dave. That was where that comes from. Brazil, I think that's the last film we're going to mention to you. Hooray! Possibly one of the best films ever, I think. Actually, I think I can say that without any fear of contradiction. I like Terry Gilliam. I love Terry Gilliam, and he has obviously, you know, he's nicked stuff from Brian Froud and things in the past. That in Time Bandits, where the boat is going through the sea, and then it comes up and it's on the head of a giant. That's a Brian Froud image, just kind of pinched, basically. I love Terry Gilliam, but I don't really love very many of his films because I don't think they're ever really good. I think that the scripts are always wonky. They don't really work. Or they're full of sort of substandard bits of, you know, Jabberwocky is basically made out of bits that were rejected from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's kind of like the offcuts of old Python sketches. But Brazil is a work of genius. I think it's a fantastic script. I think it's possibly Tom Stoppard's doing. He was the sort of at least brought in a script doctor on Gilliam's script. And it just makes sense and it works. I think it's a magnificent thing. And again, there's that visual thing. It's that idea of using a future that's made out of bits of the past, which is a little bit Star Wars. And it goes more so in Brazil. It's almost like a parallel world. It's sort of a mad, crazed 1940s or 1950s. And that was a big influence on me. And again, when I came to write Mortal Engines, I was partly thinking of sort of H.G. Wells and stuff, but also I was thinking very much of Brazil. And one of the reasons that I gave Mortal Engines a kind of vaguely Victorian vibe in those pre-steampunk days wasn't because I was anticipating steampunk, it was because my instinct originally was to make it like this. And then I thought, no, that's too Brazil. I know, I'll make it a bit more Victorian. So Brazil is another constant and enduring influence. Neuromancer by William Gibson isn't a constant and enduring influence. It's a very good book, I now realise. He's a great writer, and I've enjoyed many of his books. But when this came out in about 1984, 5, something like that, I probably didn't read it as soon as it came out. I remember getting it from the library, I was at art college in Cambridge by that time, and still reading science fiction. I got Neuromancer from the library and went down to one of the parks by the river one sunny day and started reading it, and got about sort of a third of the way through and thought, don't really know what's going on or why I should, it's all about computers and stuff going on inside computers. And, I don't really like computers. I can't see them ever catching on in a big way. Surely that's not what the future's going to be about. And I gave up. I abandoned it. I've been back to it since and finished it, but at that time that was the end of my science fiction reading. I kind of gave up on science fiction then. I kept on. I kept on. I'd still go and see films. I'd still watch sci-fi shows on telly if they came on. But I didn't bother reading science fiction for a long, long time after that. I just sort of somehow grown out of it, or thought I had, or sort of maybe I don't know. Maybe I thought I should be reading serious literature, and that would make girls like me, that kind of thing. So that was, in a way, an influence, because it sort of ended that period of my reading. But I still liked escapism. I still wasn't particularly interested in books set in the everyday world. I still wanted to be taken to new worlds by the books I read. I tended to get it more in my 20s and early 30s. I tended to get that a lot more from historical fiction, which had always been a love of mine. I loved Rosemary Sutcliffe when I was growing up. She was, as easily as much as Tolkien, she would have been a great favourite of mine as a child. Her stories of mostly sort of Dark Age and prehistoric Britain and early medieval times. She's a great writer, actually. You can go back and read her, and she's superb. She's a wonderful wordsmith. And she was disabled. She was quite seriously stricken with, I think, a form of polio. So she can't have sort of walked much or anything like that. But she has this amazing ability to describe sort of upland landscapes, the wilds of Scotland and places like that. She's incredibly good at these things, presumably coming from her imagination. So it's a great testament to the power of the writer's imagination. But although presumably she never went to these places, I don't know enough about her to really know if she had periods of health when she got out, but I don't think she did. Patrick O'Brian became a great love of mine. Has anybody read these? Oh yeah, go and read Patrick O'Brian. He's fantastic. I was working in a bookshop in the 80s, and people used to keep coming and buying these, and I think, why on earth? I assumed it was sort of like Hornblower or something, these sort of Nelson era naval stories. And eventually, I was on late shift and there was nothing to do, and I sort of started reading Master and Commander, and I was hooked instantly. They're fantastic. They're very, very funny and rich and strange books. They don't quite follow. They sort of start off as war stories. The ship is sent off to frustrate the French in some way or another. But they kind of quickly lose that, and the fighting and stuff becomes kind of incidental. It's really all about the characters. It's about it's this great pairing of characters. They're kind of like Holmes and Watson or Spock and Kirk. It's this wonderful kind of odd couple characterization. There's the Captain Jack Aubrey, who's this sort of bluff, high Tory, not particularly bright naval captain. He's not particularly bright on land, but at sea, he's fantastically good at his job, obviously. But he has no great sort of intellectual pretensions. And then he has a surgeon, Dr. Maturin, who's sort of Irish Republican. And Jack is sort of big and bluff and handsome, and Maturin is this sort of rather weedy, wizened, ugly character. Who is a great intellectual and a great sort of man of his time, a great kind of he's enlightened. He's very much against sort of for liberty and against slavery and against everything that the British Empire stands for, really, except that he's kind of against the French more, and so he's prepared to. He thinks Bonaparte is the greater of the two evils, and is prepared to throw in his lot with the Brits for as long as is needed to defeat him. And it's just one of the great pairings, I think, in adventure literature. Really, go and get Master and Commander. There's a film with Russell Crowe, who's very good. He makes a very good Jack Aubrey. It's not a bad film. It sort of takes bits from lots of the different books and makes its own story out of them. And it sort of captures part of them. It kind of captures the battles and the storms and that sort of element of it. But what it doesn't really capture is the fine details of the characterization. There's a bit where Jack, the captain, has this story that he quite often tells. There are these great dinners in O'Brien. They're always having these fantastic shipboard feasts, and it describes all the conversation that goes on around the table. And Jack is forever telling the story of how he once met Nelson, and Nelson actually spoke to him and said, "Pass the salt." In the film, this is a joke. He's saying, you know, he's making a joke of it. But oh yes, and he said he actually spoke to me. He said, "Pass the salt." But in the books, you sense that actually Jack is kind of quite, you know, really still quite awed that Nelson asked him to pass the salt. And that's the difference between the film and the book. There's kind of more depth of character. There's more eccentricity in it. So read those. I think they would, you know, I think they will appeal to science fiction and fantasy fans as much as to historical buffs, because it's this thing of creating a world again, and it does. It creates this sort of huge 18th, 19th century world and plunges you into it and immerses you in it. Last one. This is the last. This is the final. This provided the spark that set me writing Mortal Engines. This is a book called Fire's Astonishment by Geraldine McCaughrean, and I was working in a bookshop and I wasn't sure where to shelve this quite. I wasn't sure if it was literature or fantasy or what. It's got a dragon on the front, not a very good dragon. I think it's an old Games Workshop dragon, actually. It's been drafted into the early 80s collage boom, which rendered so many book covers slightly dodgy. And so I thought, well, I could put it in fantasy or I could put it in literature. I'd just go and read it. So I took it off on holiday with me. I was off to Paris and I sat and read that in my hotel of an evening. God, it's fantastic. It's a wonderful book. It's based on a medieval ballad that I hadn't heard at the time I think the young son of a lord who is transformed into he's turned into a dragon by his wicked stepmother, and his sister is turned into a fish or something to get rid of them so that she can, her son can inherit the lands. And from this kind of very slim story, Geraldine McCaughrean weaves this great kind of wonderful novel. It's just beautiful. It's amazingly well written, and it's also very exciting. You know, you kind of keep wanting to know what happens next. And it's got the best dragon ever. This poor chap has been turned into a dragon. It's full of the sort of the physicality of dragonness. It's kind of itchy scales and the great kind of wrenching muscles and bones and things. It's fantastic. And I'd never heard of her, and nor have most other people, it seems. But I just loved this book, and so I went off and I tried to find anything else by her. And she published 4 or 5 adult novels around that time, but I don't think any of them did particularly well, and I think they're all out of print now. They can be found. But she also wrote lots and lots of children's books, and so I started reading those instead, and I found that they're kind of just as good. There's an edge of cruelty that she's very good at, which doesn't come into the children's books so much. She tends to keep them a little bit more optimistic. But so her other ones are still my favourites. But she writes, like an angel. And this was one of the things that made me think, wow, I really want to write a novel. Because I've been making movies and doing kind of theatre stuff through the 80s, but by this time I'd become an illustrator, so I didn't really have time for that anymore. I couldn't commit myself to rehearsal schedules or anything like that. I was too busy drawing. So I thought, right, yes, I'm going to write stories and I'm going to write a book. And that was one of the things that sparked me off. And set me writing Mortal Engines. And I think one of the things that makes Mortal Engines work is that I had this long break from science fiction. Actually, I've read lots and lots of science fiction, and then I'd stopped. And by the time I wrote Mortal Engines, it was sci-fi, but it was kind of influenced more by historical novels. So that was very much more the approach that I took to it. So it's not, it isn't about great characters of the destiny. It's about little people trying to sort of muddle their way through in these vast historical events, which is kind of the way a lot of historical novels work. So I think that had a very good influence. And yes, then also the fact that Geraldine, of course, had written lots of children's books made me think, oh, okay, well, maybe Mortal Engines. When none of the adult agents wanted to touch it, I thought, well, maybe I could do this as a children's book, because if it's good enough for Geraldine, it's good enough for me. So she is kind of like the last in this kind of pantheon of people who range from Brian Froud to John Boorman to all the others, and she's like the sort of final one who set me on my way and got me writing this. And there I shall finish, because I shall end at the beginning of my career. So that's that. And if anybody's got any stories or comments, please. Stories? Well, stories are fine. Questions is the word which I was groping. Oh, that's my blog and Twitter and Facebook. So if you want to find my occasional burblings, they're on there. Thank you very much for listening.
What did you think of Jason and the Argonauts?
What do I think of Jason and the Argonauts as a movie? The Harryhausen one. I think that must have sort of come a bit early for me. I don't remember seeing that. I remember going to the cinema to see the Sinbad with Tom Baker in it.
Because that's
and
the
then
last
the
of
next one.
the three Sinbad.
Right. I guess I would have caught Jason and the Argonauts and things on telly. And of course there were programmes in those days like Screen Test. Does anybody remember Screen Test? Where they would show a clip of a movie and then ask questions about it. And of course Jason and the Argonauts was quite often... So I remember, I'd seen the action scenes. I'd seen like the big steel, the bronze man standing across the harbour and picking the boat up and shaking it and stuff like that. I'd seen those sequences and the skeleton warriors fighting. Which were, they, of course, yes, they were important, but they were important to me in bits because I'd never actually seen the complete movie.
I've got I was just thinking of Brazil because I've got the deluxe Laserdisc edition of Brazil.
Right, yes.
Because I'm a very sad person. I also have the Criterion issue of Jason and the Argonauts, and it shows you how they did the skeleton fight. And it's like guys with hockey vests on with numbers being the skeletons.
Yeah.
And the actors rehearsing the moves until they got it right, so they could put the stop motion skeletons in afterwards.
Right. So the guys with the hockey vest actually in the shot when they're filming, or they're just for rehearsals. They take them out.
The actors mind it.
Right.
And
Yes.
then Harry
Yes.
House
Sure.
And put the skeletons in.
Yes, I love all that stuff. The first thing I before I discovered Frau and decided I wanted to be an illustrator, I think the first time I thought, oh yes, I know what I want to do. I would have liked to go into special effects, but that was in the days when there were actual models involved. I like making models, I like painting models and stuff. So I could have seen myself doing that. But once it became computerized, then it had no interest for, the results may be good, but I'm not the least bit interested in the process. So. Yes, I mean the stop motion stuff. King Kong, the original Harryhausen King Kong, that was a
Willis O'Brien.
Sorry?
Willis
O'Brien. Yes, that's
Yeah, I mean the thing is that the remake was
well, that's often the way with remakes, sadly. But yeah.
They're doing View Cinema, I think. It might be February or March, doing a showing of Blade Runner Final Cut in the cinema again. In fact, at the end of November, they're also doing 2001: Space Odyssey in the cinema. Check out your View online listings, but it's definitely happening. So, us guys in Plymouth, I think we might have a conversation at some point. Final Cut's not my favourite.
So is there another Final Cut? Or
I think it's the final cut.
It's kind of like Andrew was saying about not going back and changing books yesterday. I think once the film's out, it's kind of out.
To be fair,
really.
the first one is probably the best.
Yeah.
I've watched his director's cut, etc., and I miss the voiceover.
Yes, I miss the voiceover.
It works if you've seen the movie, but if you've never seen the movie before, that voiceover tells you so much about the background world.
Yes.
That whole thing about skin jobs, which if you don't know, if he doesn't do that film noir voiceover thing, you don't know what he's talking about.
And also, it adds a lot to the atmosphere.
Yeah.
I found it
Yeah.
needs that. It
Yeah.
needs that. It may not be the best
But he took
voiceover ever, but it just needs that.
He took that away. He added some extra stuff in at the end, but really it didn't compensate for the loss of the voiceover bit.
And I never minded the driving off into the mountains bit at the end. It didn't bother me. I can sort of see why it's. I understand it was tacked on, and when you think about it, it doesn't actually relate to the rest of the story. But it didn't bother me at all. So no, I think the first one was the best in that case.
Yeah. Have you seen the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus?
Yes.
That was oddly enough a film I thought that was improved by name's gone. Lee Hedger. He's Hedger dying in it. Because the work around for it and bringing the other actors in, I actually thought improved the movie from what it would be.
Yes. I always find this with Gilliam that it's got magnificent bits, but they don't actually add up to a story, and that's what makes Brazil so good. Is that the bits all serve quite an interesting story and quite a
I have a soft
interesting
spot for him
ideas.
because he's odd and weird.
No, visually I love him.
Yeah, sometimes you cope with the cope with a basic, slightly dodgy story purely to watch the visuals.
Mm.
Some of the other movies you mentioned, like Labyrinth. And,
Yes.
Yeah, to be honest, having a simple story means that you're more engrossed in the world
Yeah.
and all the
Yes.
epicness that Henderson created. Because if you had a complicated plot, you'd miss half of that.
Yes, I suppose that's true. Yeah, Dark Crystal particularly is a wonderful bit of world
Yeah.
building. Even there's this sort of thing where in this world the plants are a bit like animals and the animals are a bit like plants. So you have these sort of creatures that seem to have taken root, and then you have plants that all kind of, as you walk past them, all go and go twittering off. And it's just little tiny little details thrown in. They're beautiful. Anyway, there's nothing there, not all of that is good stuff that I've been talking about, but I would recommend all of it. I love all of it for one reason or another. So here we go. Right, thank you very much again.